For nearly 2,000 years, they remained hidden beneath the desert stone, sealed away in darkness, and touched by time, preserved by a climate so harsh, so unforgiving, that nothing living could survive, and yet, somehow, these fragile objects stood waiting, patient as the stone itself, waiting for the modern world to finally discover them. In caves carved into the limestone cliffs, overlooking one of the most hostile landscapes on Earth, the shores of the Dead Sea, a discovery would slowly emerge that could challenge the very foundations of religious history itself. Not a single document, not a fragment, but hundreds upon hundreds of ancient manuscripts, a library buried beneath the desert, hidden in plain sight for 20 centuries, inside clay jars, sealed against the elements and preserved by an almost impossible accident of climate and geography, were texts older than anyone had believed possible. The dry desert air, the stable cave temperatures, the total absence of moisture. Together, they had done what no vault, no library, no archive in the modern world could replicate. They had kept these words alive. In the year 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd named Mohammed Ed-Dib was tending his goats near the cliffs of Qumran. Looking for a lost animal, or perhaps simply curious, he threw a stone into the darkness of a cave opening above him, and heard the sound that changed history, the crack of breaking pottery, the echo of something ancient, disturbed for the first time in 2,000 years. What he found inside those jars were ancient scrolls, manuscripts wrapped in linen, texts written in a hand so precise, so deliberate, that someone had clearly considered this material worth protecting for eternity. They were texts buried for nearly 2 millennia, and now, against all probability, they had survived. The world was told that this was one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. And on the surface, the story seemed clean, simple, miraculous, even. Ancient texts, desert caves, a shepherd boy. It had all the qualities of a discovery people wanted to believe in. But even in the earliest days, not everyone was satisfied with the version of the story they were being given. According to the official narrative, a Jewish sect known as the Essenes had produced these texts at their community settlement in Qumran, a remote desert outpost near the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. As the Roman army advanced on Jerusalem in the 1st century, the story goes, these devoted scholars had gathered their most sacred writings, sealed them in jars, and hidden them in the surrounding caves, hoping, perhaps, to return one day. That version of events became fixed. It appeared in textbooks across the world. It filled the display cases of museums. It was repeated in documentaries, academic papers, and school curricula for decades. The Essenes wrote the scrolls. The Romans threatened Jerusalem. The scrolls were hidden. End of story. Except, it wasn't. Because behind that carefully managed narrative, behind the museum glass and the institutional consensus, another story was quietly unfolding. A story that fewer people were allowed to see. A story hidden not in desert caves, but in locked archive rooms and restricted research files. A story of restricted access, of suppression, of accusations, serious, credible accusations, of deliberate control over the most important religious documents ever discovered. Who controlled the scrolls? Who decided what the world was told? And what, exactly, were they afraid the public might find? For decades after the initial discovery, independent scholars were denied access to the scrolls. Not occasionally, not briefly. For nearly 40 years, a small, hand-picked team of researchers held an exclusive monopoly over the material. You could not study the scrolls unless they allowed you to, and most of the time, they did not. Most of the material remained unpublished, hidden from public examination for nearly half a century after its discovery. Thousands of fragmented pieces, photographs locked in private collections, translations that existed only in draft, never released, the greatest religious discovery of the modern era, and the world was being told to wait. A small, hand-picked team controlled access to the scrolls, and they moved with extraordinary slowness. Critics accused them of sitting on material that could reshape the study of early religion. Supporters argued the work was simply complex, requiring care and precision. But as the decades passed, and the documents remained unpublished, patience began to run out. Many of those critics pointed toward the influence of powerful religious institutions, and in particular, toward the Vatican. Several of the scholars given exclusive access to the scrolls had direct connections to Catholic institutions. Their theological commitments, some argued, created an unavoidable conflict of interest when it came to material that might challenge the foundations of Christian History. One member of the original team broke ranks entirely. John Allegro, a British scholar, and the only non-religious member of the core group, publicly accused his colleagues of suppressing material that directly challenged Orthodox Christianity. He went further than almost anyone before him. He claimed the scrolls contained parallels to the Jesus story so striking that the establishment simply could not afford to let them be read freely. He was dismissed as a sensationalist. His academic reputation suffered. His colleagues publicly distanced themselves from him. And yet, the questions he raised did not disappear. They could not be made to disappear, because the core problem remained. Why were these documents still unpublished? What was taking so long? Then, in 1991, everything changed. In a move that shocked the academic world, the Huntington Library in California announced that it would open its photographic collection of the Dead Sea Scrolls to any qualified researcher who wished to examine them. No permission required. No gatekeepers. No monopoly. The monopoly that had held for nearly 4 decades was finally broken. Scholars from across the world began studying the complete collection for the first time. And what they found, when they finally had unrestricted access, was far more complex and far more explosive than the official story had ever suggested. The scrolls revealed a Jewish world saturated with messianic expectation, a community waiting for a deliverer, watching the skies, counting the days. Many of the descriptions found within these manuscripts sounded strikingly familiar to anyone who knew the foundations of early Christianity: shared property, communal meals, ritual washing, a sacred teacher whose words carried divine authority. These were not vague similarities. They were structural parallels, written down in Hebrew centuries before the church existed. The war scroll described a final cosmic battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, a war at the end of time, a reckoning. Its language echoed the book of Revelation more closely than any previously known Jewish source. The imagery, the structure, the tone of absolute, divine finality, these were not coincidences. They were a shared vocabulary, a shared world of ideas that predated the New Testament itself. Then there was the mysterious figure the scrolls called the teacher of righteousness, a spiritual leader, a persecuted prophet, rejected by those in power, condemned by his enemies, yet vindicated, according to the texts beyond death. The parallels to the gospel accounts of Jesus were impossible to completely ignore. Scholars debated them fiercely. Some saw profound connections. Others insisted the similarities were superficial, but the conversation could no longer be avoided. None of this proves that Christianity was copied directly from Qumran. That is not what the evidence shows, and responsible scholarship does not claim otherwise. But what the scrolls do reveal is a first-century Judaism far more diverse, far more fragmented, and far more intellectually alive than most people had ever been taught. Multiple sects, competing visions of the Messiah, apocalyptic expectation running through every layer of Jewish life, and that complexity, that richness poses deeply uncomfortable questions for institutions that have built their authority on simplified, tidy histories. Even today, scholars still debate who actually wrote the scrolls. The dominant theory, the Essene theory, holds that this isolated desert community at Qumran produced the manuscripts themselves, a monastic sect devoted to copying scripture and awaiting the end of the world. But researcher Norman Gold proposed a far more disruptive alternative. What if the scrolls did not come from Qumran at all? What if they were gathered from multiple libraries across Jerusalem, the accumulated literary wealth of an entire city, hidden in the caves as the Roman armies closed in on the capital? The site of Qumran itself offers no clear answer. Some archaeologists say it was a religious settlement. Others argue it was a military outpost, or even a wealthy private estate. The ruins stubbornly refuse to tell one single story. The archaeology refuses to provide one clear answer. And that ambiguity matters, because the entire Essene theory rests on assumptions about Qumran that the physical evidence does not fully support. And then there was the most mysterious artifact of all. Unlike every other manuscript in the collection, written on leather, on papyrus, on fragile parchment, this one was different, engraved, etched into a sheet of pure copper. Inside was a list, not scripture, not commentary, not prophecy, a list of hidden treasure locations. Gold, silver, sacred temple objects, vessels and containers of extraordinary value. The scroll described 64 separate hiding places, scattered across the landscape of ancient Judea, Some researchers believe the copper scroll records the hidden wealth of the Jerusalem temple itself, the sacred treasury, concealed before the Roman destruction of 70 AD, waiting to be recovered. Its publication was delayed even longer than the rest of the collection, and when it was finally released, the academic establishment mostly dismissed it, labeling it folklore, legend, wishful thinking, but no systematic search for the locations it describes has ever truly been completed. Political conflict, disputed territory, and the extraordinary complexity of the landscape have prevented any serious, organized excavation. Which raises a haunting possibility. What if the treasure is still there? Because the Dead Sea Scrolls are not merely archaeological artifacts. They are not simply old pieces of paper in museum display cases. They are documents tied directly to the control of religious history itself, to the management of foundational narratives, to the question of who gets to decide what the origins of faith actually look like. And institutions, powerful institutions, institutions with centuries of authority behind them, rarely surrender control over foundational narratives willingly. They delay. They restrict. They manage access. They shape the story before it reaches the public. Not always through outright deception. Sometimes simply through slowness, through silence. Today, the scrolls are finally available to the world. High-resolution digital images, online archives, open-access databases that anyone with an internet connection can explore. The monopoly is over. The gatekeepers are gone. Anyone can study these texts now, not just approved scholars, not just those with institutional connections, but anyone who wishes to look. And yet the questions they raise remain unresolved. What if the origins of religious history are more complicated than we were ever taught? What if the traditions we inherited, the stories we were handed as children, as students, as believers, were always more tangled, more contested, more human than we were allowed to see? For 2,000 years, narratives hardened into doctrine. Complexity was smoothed away. Competing traditions were buried. Alternative voices fell silent. And buried beneath those narratives, in dry desert caves, in copper etchings, in fragments too small to read with the naked eye, fragments of forgotten truth survived. The caves still overlook the Dead Sea today, silent and changed. The same wind moves across the same limestone cliffs. The same desert silence holds. They have watched empires rise and fall. They watched Rome burn Jerusalem. They watched centuries of pilgrims, armies, scholars, and wanderers pass below without ever knowing what lay hidden above. They are silent witnesses to history's greatest secrets. The real question is not whether the Dead Sea Scrolls changed history. They did. They changed how we understand the ancient world, the origins of faith, and the complexity of the human search for meaning. The real question is whether we are willing to sit with what they truly imply. Whether we are willing to accept that the past was messier, richer, and stranger than the clean official versions we have been given. Because the most dangerous discoveries are never the ones we fail to uncover, they are the ones we choose to ignore. For more ancient mysteries and hidden histories, stories buried beneath the surface of the official narrative, subscribe and keep exploring. The past is never as settled as we are told. Until next time, stay curious.